The sun rose on a special day in London. People woke up early and rushed to the streets. They wanted to see something that happens only once in many years, a coronation. Today, King Charles II would be crowned. Everyone in Britain felt excited. In a grand house called Kensington Palace, the Wales family was already awake. Prince William stood in front of a mirror, checking his Royal Navy uniform. Every button shined. His medals from years of service hung perfectly on his chest. He took a deep breath. This was not just any day. His father would become king, and William was now one step closer to the throne himself. In another room, Kate helped her children get ready. She had already dressed in her beautiful white and silver gown made by her favorite designer, Alexander McQueen. Small flowers and plants were sewn into the dress. They stood for England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, all parts of the United Kingdom. "Money, is my tie straight?" asked Prince George, who was 9 years old. He looked serious in his small black suit. Kate smiled and fixed his tie. "Perfect. Remember, many people will be watching today," she said gently. George nodded. Even though he was young, he understood that one day he too would be king. Princess Charlotte twirled in her white dress. At 7 years old, she loved special events. "Will I have to sit still the whole time?" she asked, already knowing the answer. "Yes, just like we practiced," Kate said. "It's a long ceremony, but very important." 4-year-old Prince Louis jumped on the bed in his little suit. "Louis, please be careful with your clothes," William said as he walked into the room. Louis stopped jumping and grinned. Everyone knew he was the most lively child in the family. "Will Grandpa look different with a crown?" Louis asked. William picked him up. "Yes, but he'll still be the same grandpa who reads you stories." Louis nodded, trying to understand. Outside, the streets filled with more and more people. They carried flags and pictures of the royal family. Some had camped overnight to hit the best spots to watch. They wanted to see the golden carriages and the royal family. Back at the palace, royal helpers rushed around with last-minute details. A lady fixed Kate's hair, placing a flower headpiece on top. Another person checked William's medals one more time. Security guards talked into their earpieces, making sure everything was safe. The children stood together by a window, looking at the crowds below. "Look how many people came," Charlotte said, waving at someone who couldn't see her through the palace windows. "They're here for Great-Grandma's crown," George explained to his younger brother. "Now Grandpa will wear it." A palace worker knocked on the door. "Your Royal Highnesses, the cars are ready." William looked at his family. "Is everyone ready?" he asked. Kate nodded and straightened Louis's little bow tie one last time. They walked through the long palace halls with their footsteps echoing on the marble floors. Paintings of kings and queens from hundreds of years ago seemed to watch them pass. These were William's ancestors, and his children's too. Outside, 3 shiny black cars waited. Guards stood nearby. The family climbed into the middle car, with Louis sitting between his parents. "Wave to the people when they can see you," Kate reminded the children as the car began to move. The gates of the palace opened, and suddenly they could hear cheers. Thousands of people lined the streets, waving and taking pictures. Police officers kept everyone safe. The car drove slowly through London's famous streets. The children looked out the windows with wide eyes. They passed big red buses that had stopped for them, and buildings decorated with flags. They were heading to Westminster Abbey, an ancient church where kings and queens had been crowned for nearly 1,000 years. Soon, they would walk into this historic place as the world watched. Their car moved closer and closer to the Abbey, where their lives would change forever. The royal car moved slowly through the packed London streets. Inside, Prince Louis pressed his nose against the window, leaving small smudges that made Kate smile. The closer they got to Westminster Abbey, the bigger the crowds became. People waved flags and cheered loudly when they spotted the Wales family car. "Look at all the people," Charlotte said, waving back at the crowds even though the car windows were tinted. William checked his watch. "We're right on time," he said to Kate. Being late was not an option on such an important day. The car turned onto the final street, and suddenly the grand Westminster Abbey stood before them. Its tall towers reached up to the blue sky, and its stone walls had stood for over 700 years. "It looks like a castle from my books," Lewis said, his eyes wide. "Kings and queens have been crowned here for hundreds of years," George told his brother, proud of knowing this fact. "Now Grandpa will be crowned here too." The car stopped at the red carpet leading to the Abbey's main door. Outside, royal guards stood straight and tall in their bright red uniforms and tall black furry hats. TV cameras pointed at the car, ready to show the Wales family to the whole world. A man in a fancy uniform opened the car door. William stepped out first and buttoned his jacket. He stood tall, looking every bit like the future king he would one day be. Then Kate stepped out, her dress catching the light and sparkling. People gasped at how beautiful she looked. William turned and helped George out of the car. The young prince blinked in the bright sunlight and stood close to his father. Charlotte came next, remembering to keep her back straight like she had been taught. She gave a small wave to the crowd, making people cheer even louder. Lewis was last to step out. He looked around at all the people and cameras with big, curious eyes. For a moment, he seemed unsure, but then William bent down and whispered something in his ear. Lewis smiled and stood up straighter. "Wave to everyone," Kate said quietly to the children as they all stood together for the cameras. The family waved, and hundreds of camera flashes went off at once, like stars twinkling. The bells of Westminster Abbey began to ring, their deep sounds filling the air. This was the signal that it was almost time for the ceremony to begin. Important guests were already inside, waiting for the royal family. A man in a black robe bowed to William and Kate. "Your Royal Highnesses, if you would please follow me," he said. This man was the Dean of Westminster, a very important person at the Abbey. The family walked slowly up the red carpet. Kate held Lewis's hand tightly so he wouldn't run off. Charlotte walked perfectly, taking small steps like she had practiced. George kept his eyes forward, trying to be as grown-up as possible. As they reached the huge wooden doors of the Abbey, they paused. Inside, they could hear music playing. An orchestra and choir were performing special songs for the coronation. "Remember what we talked about," Kate said to the children. "This is a very long ceremony. You need to sit still and be quiet, even when it gets boring." Lewis whispered, making William hide a smile. "Especially when it gets boring," Kate answered with a wink. The dean nodded to some men in uniform, and they pulled open the giant doors. The sound of the music grew louder, and the smell of incense and flowers floated out to greet them. The inside of Westminster Abbey looked magical. Thousands of candles lit the space, making the gold decorations shine. Flowers in white, blue, and red covered the ends of the long rows of seats. The ceiling seemed to reach up forever, with stone arches meeting high above. 2,000 people stood up as the Wales family entered. Kings, queens, presidents, and prime ministers from countries all around the world turned to watch them walk in. The children's eyes grew wide at the sight of so many important people in one place. "Walk slowly, just like we practiced," William reminded them as they began their journey down the long aisle toward their special seats near the front of the Abbey. The Wales family began their slow walk down the long aisle of Westminster Abbey. The floor was made of smooth stone worn down by millions of footsteps over hundreds of years. Above them, the ceiling stretched so high it almost hurt their necks to look up. Every step they took echoed in the huge space. The music from the choir filled the air with beautiful sounds that seemed to float around them. 2,000 pairs of eyes watched as the family walked by. Kate gently guided Lewis with her hand on his shoulder. The young prince was trying his best to walk properly, but his eyes darted everywhere, taking in all the amazing things around him. Gold crosses, colorful windows that told stories in glass, and flags hanging from the ceiling all caught his attention. "Look at the windows," Charlotte whispered to Louis, pointing to the huge stained glass that made colored light dance on the floor. Louis nodded, his mouth slightly open in wonder. George walked close to his father, copying William's straight back and steady pace. The young prince knew that someday he would walk down this same aisle for his own coronation. This thought made him stand even taller. As they moved forward, they passed rows of very important people. Kings and queens from other countries nodded at William and Kate. Famous actors, sports stars, and world leaders smiled at the children. Some people wore bright uniforms covered in medals. Others wore beautiful dresses and huge hats in every color. "That's the president," George whispered to Charlotte, recognizing one of the world leaders from pictures he had seen. In the middle of the abbey stood a special platform with a golden chair on it. This was the coronation chair, where William's father would sit to become king. It was over 700 years old and had been used for many kings and queens before. "That's where Grandpa will sit," Charlotte said to Louis, who was staring at the ancient chair with wide eyes. "With the crown?" Louis asked, a bit too loudly. A few people nearby smiled at his innocent question. "Yes, with the crown," Kate whispered back, gently reminding him to use his quiet voice. As they neared the front of the abbey, they could see members of their family already seated. Princess Anne, Prince Edward, and other royals sat in special chairs with red cushions. The family would all be together to watch this historic moment. William led his family to their places in the front row. Their seats had small cards with their names written in beautiful gold letters. Kate helped the children find their places, George next to William, then Charlotte, then Louis next to her. Louis bounced a little on his seat, testing how soft it was, until Kate gave him a gentle look. He stopped right away and tried to sit like his brother and sister, back straight, hands folded neatly in his lap. People around them whispered about how well-behaved the royal children were. Even little Louis was trying his hardest to be good on this special day. A lady behind them said quietly to her neighbor, "The Princess of Wales has done such a wonderful job with those children." Charlotte heard this and sat up even straighter, proud that people thought they were being good. She reached over and fixed Louis's little tie, acting like a helpful big sister. The organ music suddenly changed, and everyone in the abbey became quiet. The ceremony was about to begin. William leaned over to his children. "Remember, this is a day you will tell your own children about someday," he said softly. The three young royals nodded, understanding that they were part of something very important. Kate checked that all three children had their special coronation books. These small books explained what would happen during the ceremony, with pictures to help the children understand each part. She opened Louis's book to the first page and pointed to a picture of the king entering. "This will happen next," she whispered. Louis nodded seriously, his eyes now fixed on the main doors at the back of the abbey. The huge church became completely silent. Even the smallest sound could be heard in the stillness. George, Charlotte, and Louis sat perfectly still, waiting. The most important part was about to begin. Their grandfather was coming to be crowned King of England. Suddenly, the trumpets began to play a grand, loud tune. The sound filled every corner of Westminster Abbey. All 2,000 people stood up at once, including the Wales family. The great doors at the end of the aisle opened wide. King Charles II had arrived for his coronation. The trumpets played their loud, happy song as everyone in Westminster Abbey stood up straight. The Wales children stretched to see over the tall people in front of them. Kate lifted Louis a little so he could see better. King Charles II walked slowly down the same aisle the Wales family had just walked. He wore a special robe made of red silk with gold patterns. It was so long that 4 young boys had to carry the end of it so it wouldn't drag on the floor. On his head was a simple gold band, not the big crown yet, but a smaller one to show he was already king. "There's Grandpa," Charlotte whispered to Louis, pointing at the king. Louis waved, forgetting for a moment where they were. Kate gently took his hand and held it. George watched his grandfather with serious eyes. Someday, after his father, he would be the one walking down this aisle to be crowned. He tried to remember every detail. As King Charles passed by their row, he gave a small nod to William. Father and son shared a look that said many things without words. William's eyes were shining with pride, and maybe even some tears. This was a moment they had both known would come someday, but no one knew when. The king reached the special platform and stood before the golden chair. The Archbishop of Canterbury, an important church leader in a white and gold robe, bowed to him. The king bowed his head back, just a little. "Who comes here to be crowned?" the archbishop asked in a loud voice that filled the whole abbey. "I, Charles, come to serve the people," the king answered. Louis looked up at his mother with questioning eyes. Kate leaned down and whispered, "Grandpa is promising to be a good king." The children watched as their grandfather turned to face the people in the abbey. The archbishop asked everyone if they accepted Charles as their king. The abbey filled with voices saying, "God save King Charles." The sound was so big and sudden that Louis jumped a little in his seat. Next came a part that seemed very serious. The king placed his hand on a very old book, the Bible. He promised to be fair and good to all people, to protect the church, and to follow the laws. George listened carefully to every word, knowing these were promises he might make himself someday. Charlotte noticed that her father, William, was watching with a special look on his face. She had seen that look before when he told them stories about being king someday. It was a look that was both happy and a little worried at the same time. After the promises, the king sat in the ancient coronation chair. This chair had been used by kings and queens for over 700 years. Under the seat was a special stone called the Stone of Scone, which had come all the way from Scotland for this day. "That chair is older than our house," George whispered to Charlotte, remembering a fact he had learned. Charlotte nodded, impressed. The archbishop began to pray, and everyone bowed their heads. Even Louis tried to be still and quiet during this part, though Kate could feel him fidgeting a little beside her. Then came one of the most important parts of the ceremony. The archbishop took a small bottle of special oil. This oil was blessed and very old. He made the sign of a cross with the oil on the king's hands, head, and chest. Louis wrinkled his nose. "What's that for?" he whispered. "It's to make Grandpa holy," Charlotte whispered back, repeating what she had heard in their lessons about the coronation. Next, servants brought out beautiful things that would be given to the king. A special ball called an orb, a fancy stick called a scepter, and golden spurs that kings used to wear when they rode horses. Each one meant something about being a good ruler. William watched his father receive each item with perfect calm. He felt proud, but also felt the weight of what would someday be his turn. Kate noticed his serious face and gave him a small, understanding smile. The children sat up straighter as the most exciting part was about to happen. Servants brought out the crown, St. Edward's crown. It was huge and heavy, made of solid gold, and covered with jewels that sparkled in the light from the tall windows and hundreds of candles. George, Charlotte, and Louis stared at the crown with wide eyes. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The archbishop lifted the crown high for everyone to see. It seemed to catch all the light in the abbey. Then, slowly and carefully, he lowered it onto King Charles's head. The moment the crown touched the king's head, trumpets sounded again. The whole abbey filled with voices shouting, "God save the king." As the shouts of "God save the king" filled Westminster Abbey, little Louis couldn't help himself. He clapped his hands and joined in the cheering. Kate smiled at his excitement, but gently placed her hand on his to remind him to be calm. The little prince tried his best to sit still again, but his legs swung back and forth under his chair. King Charles, now wearing the heavy St. Edward's crown, sat very straight in the ancient chair. The crown was so heavy that it took real strength to hold his head up. George noticed this and whispered to Charlotte, "Grandpa is strong to wear that big crown." Charlotte nodded. "It's full of real jewels. That's why it's so heavy." Louis leaned over. "Will Daddy wear that crown someday?" he asked, a bit too loudly. A few people turned to look at the little boy. Kate put her finger to her lips, but her eyes were kind. "Yes," she whispered very quietly. "And then George after that." George sat up even taller when he heard this. The idea that he would one day wear that same crown made him feel both proud and a little nervous. The ceremony continued as the king stood up carefully, balancing the heavy crown. He moved to a different, even more decorated chair called the throne. As he sat down, all the important lords and ladies of the country came forward one by one to kneel before him and promise to serve him. First was William. The children watched as their father walked to the throne and knelt before the king. Even though Charles was his father, William now had to treat him as his king too. He took the king's hand and kissed it, then said words of promise that had been said by princes for hundreds of years. "I, William, Prince of Wales, become your liege man of life and limb, and earthly worship. Faith and truth I will bear unto you, to live and die against all manner of folks. So help me God." Louis tried to repeat some of the big words but got mixed up. Charlotte giggled quietly behind her hand. After William returned to his seat, other royal family members did the same. The children sat through this long part of the ceremony, trying their best to be good. Kate had packed small coronation books with pictures to keep them busy. Louis looked at the pictures while George read the words quietly to himself. But the ceremony was very long, and little Louis was finding it harder to sit still. He began to fidget more and more. He leaned against his mother, then sat up, then leaned the other way against Charlotte. He made faces at a little girl across the aisle, who tried not to laugh. "Louis," Kate whispered, "just a little longer." "But it's been forever," Louis whispered back, loud enough for several people to hear. Some smiled, understanding how hard it was for a young child to sit through such a long event. William glanced over at his youngest son, giving him a look that said, "Be good," but with a small smile hidden behind it. Louis sighed and tried to sit still again. The choir began to sing a beautiful song that echoed around the high stone ceiling. The children listened, and even Louis seemed calmer as the music washed over them. Charlotte closed her eyes for a moment, feeling the beautiful sounds. George watched the singers, noticing how they all breathed together and followed the leader's hands. Suddenly, Louis pointed up. "Look," he said, forgetting to whisper. Everyone followed his gaze. The sun had moved during the long ceremony, and now it shone through one of the great stained glass windows. It sent beams of colored light, red, blue, and gold, directly onto the king and his crown. The jewels in the crown caught the light and seemed to sparkle with fire. "It's magic," Louis whispered, truly quiet for the first time. "It's not magic," George started to say, always practical. But Charlotte stopped him. "Maybe it is a little magic," she said. Kate smiled at her children. Even at their young ages, they could feel how special this moment was. The colored light, the ancient church, the music, and their grandfather wearing the crown that had been worn by kings and queens for hundreds of years. It was all part of a tradition older than any of them could truly understand. William caught Kate's eye across their children's heads. They shared a look of pride, not just for the king, but for their children who were doing their best on this historic day that they would remember all their lives. The light shifted, and the colored beams moved slowly across the abbey floor. Louis watched them with wonder in his eyes, finally still and quiet as the coronation ceremony continued. The coronation ceremony was coming to an end. After nearly 2 hours of sitting, the Wales children were getting restless. Even George, who had been trying so hard to be perfect, was shifting in his seat. Charlotte kept smoothing her dress, and Louis had been quietly playing with the program, folding it into different shapes. Almost done, Kate whispered to the children with an encouraging smile. Louis looked up at her with hopeful eyes. The Archbishop said the final prayers, and the choir sang one last beautiful song. Then King Charles stood up, still wearing the heavy crown. Everyone in Westminster Abbey stood too. The king began to walk slowly back down the aisle, carrying the orb and scepter. As the king passed their row, William bowed his head slightly. George, watching his father, did the same. Charlotte and Louis copied their brother, Charlotte with a perfect small curtsy and Louis with a wobbly bow that made some nearby people smile. Following the king would be the most important members of the royal family, including the Wales family. William and Kate gathered their children. "Remember how we practiced?" William said quietly. "Walk slowly and keep looking forward." The family stepped into the aisle behind the other senior royals. George walked tall and straight. Charlotte kept perfect time with her steps, and Louis tried his very best to walk like his brother and sister. "You're doing wonderfully," Kate whispered to the children. The great doors of Westminster Abbey opened wide, and bright sunlight streamed in. After the dim, candlelit abbey, the sunshine seemed very bright. Louis blinked and covered his eyes for a moment. Outside, the crowds had grown even bigger. Thousands of people waited to see the newly crowned king and his family. When they stepped outside, a mighty cheer went up from the crowd. The sound was so loud that Louis grabbed onto Kate's hand. "That's a lot of people," he said with wide eyes. "They're happy to see Grandpa as king," Charlotte explained to her little brother. Big, fancy carriages waited for them. The king and Queen Camilla got into the first one, a golden carriage that sparkled in the sunlight. William, Kate, and their children would ride in the second carriage. Louis's face lit up when he saw it. "We get to ride in that?" he asked excitedly. "Yes, all the way back to the palace," William answered, smiling at his son's excitement. A footman in a red uniform helped them into the carriage. Inside, the seats were soft red velvet. The children sat across from their parents, with George in the middle. As the carriage began to move, Louis and Charlotte waved to the crowds through the windows. People cheered and took pictures. Some called out the children's names. George waved too, but more carefully, trying to copy the royal wave he had seen his father and grandfather do. The horses pulled the carriage through the streets of London. Everywhere they looked, there were flags and decorations. Some buildings had huge pictures of the king hanging from their walls. People had brought food and drinks and were having parties right in the street. "It's like one big birthday party for Grandpa," Charlotte said. "For the whole country," William added. The carriage turned onto the Mall, the wide road that led straight to Buckingham Palace. Here, the crowds were even bigger. People stood 10 deep along the sides of the road, all cheering and waving flags. The noise was amazing, like being at the loudest sports game ever. Louis looked out with big eyes. "Are all these people here just for today?" he asked. "Yes," Kate said. "They want to be part of history." "And we're part of history too?" Louis asked. "Very much so," William said, looking proudly at his 3 children. As they got closer to Buckingham Palace, they could see it standing tall and grand at the end of the mall. Its many windows gleamed in the sun, and the royal flag flew above it, showing that the king was now heading home. "Look," Charlotte pointed. "People are already at the palace gates." She was right. Huge crowds had gathered in front of the palace. They filled the whole area, making a sea of happy faces and waving flags. The carriage drove through the palace gates and into the courtyard, away from the public's eyes. But the family knew their day wasn't over yet. "Do we go on the balcony now?" George asked, remembering the plan for the day. "Yes," William said. "The people will want to see the king with his crown. And all of us too." Louis clapped his hands. "I like the balcony. You can see forever from up there." The carriage stopped. As footmen helped them out, they could hear the crowd outside the palace gates chanting, "We want the king. We want the king." The Wales family hurried inside to prepare for their appearance on the famous Buckingham Palace balcony, where they would stand beside the newly crowned king for all the world to see. Inside Buckingham Palace, servants rushed around getting everything ready. The Wales family walked quickly through the grand hallways. The children looked around with wide eyes. Even though they had been here many times before, the palace seemed extra special today. "Can I fix my hair?" Charlotte asked, touching her head. The wind from the carriage ride had messed up her perfect hairstyle a little. "Of course," Kate said, bending down to help her daughter. She smoothed Charlotte's hair and straightened her dress. Then she checked Louis's little suit and fixed his crook tie. George stood tall, trying to look grown-up. William placed a hand on his son's shoulder with a proud smile. "You've all done very well today," he told the children. "Just a little longer on the balcony, and then you can relax." A palace worker approached them. "Your Royal Highnesses, the king is ready. Please follow me to the balcony doors." They walked through more fancy rooms with golden furniture and huge paintings until they reached a set of tall glass doors. Through the doors, they could see the famous balcony where royal families had stood for over 100 years on special days. King Charles was waiting for them, still wearing his crown and royal robes. Queen Camilla stood beside him in her crown too. They both smiled when they saw the children. "Grandpa, your crown is so shiny," Louis said, making everyone laugh. "Yes, it is rather heavy too," the king replied with a warm smile. He bent down a little, carefully because of the heavy crown, and added, "You've all been so good today. I'm very proud." The children beamed at their grandfather's praise. Other royal family members joined them, aunts, uncles, and cousins. Everyone would go onto the balcony together to wave to the huge crowds waiting outside. "Listen to that," William said. They all became quiet and heard the sound of thousands of people chanting and cheering outside the palace gates. The noise was so loud it seemed to make the floor shake. "They're calling for you, Your Majesty," a palace worker said to the king. King Charles nodded. "Then we shouldn't keep them waiting." The glass doors opened. Bright sunshine poured in. The king and queen stepped out onto the balcony first. The cheers grew even louder. It sounded like thunder. William and Kate exchanged a look, and then William nodded to the children. "Our turn," he said. The Wales family stepped out onto the balcony together. The sight that met them was amazing. The entire area in front of the palace was packed with people as far as they could see. Thousands and thousands of faces looked up at them. People waved flags, took pictures, and cheered. "Wow," George said quietly, surprised by how many people had come. Charlotte waved with a perfect royal wave. Small movements from the wrist, just like she had practiced. Louis waved with his whole arm, so excited he could hardly stand still. "There must be 1,000,000 people," Louis said, making Kate smile. The family lined up along the balcony rail. King Charles stood in the middle with his crown shining in the sun. The Wales family stood to his right. Louis kept looking up at his grandfather's crown, clearly impressed by how it sparkled. Suddenly, Louis pointed to the sky. "Look," he shouted. Everyone looked up. In the distance, they could see planes coming toward the palace. The Royal Air Force was doing a special flyover to honor the new king. First came helicopters, flying in a perfect line. Then came bigger planes in groups of 3. The crowds below cheered even louder as each group of planes passed overhead. "Here come the fast ones," William told the children, pointing to the sky. Fighter jets zoomed toward them, much faster than the other planes. As they passed over Buckingham Palace, they released streams of red, white, and blue smoke, the colors of the British flag. The colored smoke made perfect lines across the blue sky. Louis jumped up and down with excitement. "Again, again," he called as the jets flew away. Even George and Charlotte couldn't help smiling widely at the spectacular sight. George counted the planes out loud, while Charlotte pointed out the different types to Louis. The king turned to his family with a warm smile. He said something that only they could hear, making them all laugh. For a moment, they weren't just royals on a balcony. They were a family sharing a special day together. The crowd below began to sing "God Save the King," the national anthem. The sound of thousands of voices singing together floated up to the balcony. The Wales children listened with serious faces, understanding how important this moment was. As the song ended, the royal family gave one final wave to the crowds. King Charles led the way back inside, followed by Queen Camilla and the others. Louis turned for one last look and waved before they went inside. A huge cheer went up from the crowd, just for him. The little prince smiled his biggest smile of the day. As the royal family stepped back inside Buckingham Palace, a change came over them. Shoulders relaxed, formal smiles softened, and the children let out little sighs of relief. The public part of the day was finally over. "Can I take my shoes off now?" Louis asked immediately, already reaching down to his shiny black shoes that had been pinching his feet all day. Kate laughed. "Not yet, sweetheart. We still have the official photos to take." Louis groaned dramatically, making King Charles chuckle. The king carefully removed his heavy crown and handed it to a waiting official who placed it on a special velvet cushion. "That does feel better," the king said, rubbing his neck. "I don't know how Queen Elizabeth wore it for so long at her coronation." "Your crown was much heavier than hers," Father William said. The family walked through the grand halls of the palace to the throne room, where photographers waited to take the official coronation pictures. Giant lights were set up, and people with cameras stood ready. "Stand up straight, everyone," said the main photographer, a small man with glasses. "These pictures will be in history books forever." That made the children stand extra tall. Even Louis managed to be still, though his eyes kept wandering to the fancy ceiling with its paintings of angels and clouds. After many pictures, the king alone, the king with Queen Camilla, the king with William, and finally the whole family together. The photographer declared he was finished. Everyone relaxed again. "Now can I take my shoes off?" Louis asked again, more urgently. "Yes, now you may," Kate said with a smile. Louis sat right down on the fancy palace floor and pulled off his shoes with a huge sigh of happiness. Charlotte giggled at her brother, but then slipped off her own shoes too when she thought no one was looking. "I'm hungry," George said quietly to his father. "Me too," said William. "Let's see if we can find some food." The king overheard them. "There's a special tea set up in the blue drawing room for family only," he said. "Let's all go there now." The children's faces lit up at the mention of food. They had been so good during the long ceremony that they deserved a treat. In the blue drawing room, a wonderful sight greeted them. Long tables were covered with every kind of delicious food. Tiny sandwiches with the crusts cut off, scones with jam and cream, small cakes covered in icing, and cookies shaped like crowns and decorated with gold. "Wow," Louis said, his eyes wide at the sight of so many sweets. The family sat down at the table, joined by other royal relatives. Servants poured tea for the adults and juice for the children. For the first time that day, everyone could relax and just be a family. "You were all so well behaved today," Kate said to her children as she helped Louis put jam on his scone. "Daddy and I are very proud of you." "Even Louis," Charlotte teased, poking her little brother gently. "Especially Louis," William said, ruffling his youngest son's hair. "It's not easy to sit still for so long when you're only 4. Louis beamed at his father's praise and took a huge bite of his jam-covered scone, getting some on his nose in the process. Kate wiped it off with a napkin, smiling. King Charles watched his family with warm eyes. He had taken off his heavy robes and now wore just his smart suit with his medals. He looked more like Grandpa than King now. "I have a special thank you for my grandchildren," the king said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out 3 small boxes and handed one to each child. George, Charlotte, and Louis opened their boxes carefully. Inside each was a small pin made of gold. It showed the crown with the date of the coronation underneath. "A memory of today," the king told them. "Not many children get to see their grandfather crowned king." "Thank you, Grandpa," the children said together, admiring their special gifts. Around them, the palace was still busy. Outside, the crowds continued to celebrate in the streets of London. There would be concerts and parties all over the country for days. But here in this room, it was just a family enjoying some quiet time together after a very big day. Charlotte yawned behind her hand, trying to hide it. The excitement and long day were catching up with all the children. "I think someone needs an early bedtime tonight," William said, noticing George yawning too. "But there's still cake," Louis protested, pointing to a chocolate cake he hadn't tried yet. Everyone laughed, and Kate put a small piece of chocolate cake on his plate. "One more piece," she said, "and then we'll go home to rest." As the family enjoyed their tea together, with Louis getting more chocolate on his face with each bite, they knew they had been part of something very special, a day that would be remembered in history books forever. As the evening shadows grew longer over London, the Wales family prepared to leave Buckingham Palace. The children were tired after their long, exciting day. Louis was almost falling asleep in his chair, his head nodding forward then jerking back up as he tried to stay awake. "I think it's time we got these little ones home," Kate said softly to William. William nodded. "It's been quite a day for all of us." The family said goodbye to King Charles and Queen Camilla. The children gave their grandfather big hugs, being careful not to wrinkle his smart suit. "You were amazing today," King Charles told them. "I couldn't have asked for better behavior from my grandchildren." "Even when I waved too much?" Louis asked sleepily. "Especially when you waved too much," the king said with a wink. It made everyone smile. Rather than use the big formal carriages again, the Wales family would go home in their regular car. Palace workers had already packed up all their things: Charlotte's spare shoes, the children's coronation books, and the special pins the king had given them. As they walked through the palace to the side entrance where their car waited, George looked at the paintings on the walls with new eyes. "All those kings in the paintings," he said thoughtfully. "They all had coronations too, just like Grandpa." "That's right," William said. "And someday, many years from now, you will too." George nodded seriously, thinking about this big idea. Outside, their car waited. The streets were quieter now as many people had gone home, though some still celebrated in the distance. The children climbed into the back seat, with Louis in the middle between his older siblings. As the car pulled away from the palace, the children looked back at the huge building with its many windows glowing with golden light in the evening. "Will Grandpa sleep in the palace tonight?" Charlotte asked. "Yes," Kate answered. "That's his home now." "In the biggest bedroom?" Louis asked, his eyes half closed with sleepiness. "In the king's bedroom," William explained. "The same room where many kings have slept before him." The car moved through the London streets. There were still flags and decorations everywhere. Some people noticed their car and waved, but most were too busy enjoying the street parties to notice them passing by. Inside the car, the children began to get even sleepier. The excitement of the day was wearing off, and now tiredness was taking over. Louis's head drooped against Charlotte's shoulder. She didn't even mind, just put her arm around her little brother. "Did you enjoy the day?" Kate asked them gently. "It was the most special day ever," Charlotte said. "I liked the planes the best," Louis mumbled without opening his eyes. "I'll remember it forever," George said seriously. William and Kate exchanged proud smiles over the children's heads. Their children had been part of history today, and they had done so well. As the car drove on, leaving the noisy city behind and heading toward their more peaceful home, Kate took out her phone. She had taken some private family pictures during quiet moments of the day. She scrolled through them now, Louis making a funny face at breakfast, Charlotte helping George fix his tie, all three children peeking out of the palace window at the crowds below. "We should print some of these," William said, looking at the pictures over her shoulder. "Not for the public, just for us." "Our own royal family album," Kate agreed. By the time they reached home, all three children were fast asleep. Louis was snoring softly, his head now on George's shoulder. Charlotte's head rested against the window. Even George had fallen asleep, his usually perfect posture relaxed. William and Kate looked at their sleeping children with love in their eyes. "Should we wake them?" William whispered. Kate shook her head. "Let's carry them in." Carefully, William lifted George, who was getting so big now. Kate took Charlotte, who only stirred a little before settling back to sleep against her mother's shoulder. A palace guard who had traveled with them gently lifted little Louis. They carried the children inside their home, away from the world's eyes. Tomorrow, pictures of the Wales family at the coronation would be in every newspaper around the world. People would talk about how well-behaved the children were, how beautiful Kate looked, how proud William seemed of his father. But tonight, they were just a family, tired after a very big day, carrying their sleeping children to bed. In his sleep, Louis still wore the little gold pin his grandfather had given him. He would keep it forever. This special reminder of the day his grandfather became king and his family was part of history. As Kate tucked the covers around Louis, he opened his sleepy eyes for just a moment. "Was today real?" he murmured. "Yes, my darling," she whispered. "It was all real. Sleep now." And he did, dreaming of crowns and carriages and airplanes painting the sky with colored smoke, a small smile on his face.